Hello people, welcome to Gurukula. I'm Jay. So today in this video we will be talking about SQL injection. So previously in this series we might have spoke about what are all the captcha vulnerabilities and how can we exploit the vulnerabilities that is present in captcha verification. So if you have not watched that particular video, I will leave the link in the description box below. You can check that out. So in this video we are going to understand what exactly database are and what are all the types of databases that is available, and slowly we will try to understand what is SQL, and we will also try to understand some basic SQL queries, so which will help us to fetch information from the databases. And after understanding all these things, we can also try to exploit the SQL vulnerabilities using SQL injection techniques. So first things first, what actually is a database? So a database is like a digital filing system that stores information in an organized way. Let's say there is a client who is sitting in front of a laptop and he has a login form displayed on his laptop, and this particular user will try to fetch information, and then he will try to add the username and then the password. So let's say username is admin and let's say the password is 123. So whatever the user that has typed here in this particular login form will be passed on to the server, and this particular server has to validate whether the credentials given by the client or the user is valid or not. So in order to perform that validation, the server passes on this information to a database, and this is where actually the database, which contains all the entries of usernames and password in the form of table. So this form of table will actually have multiple columns: ID, username, and then the passwords. So let's say the first ID belongs to username admin and the password associated with this particular user is 123. So when this particular credentials are sent to the server and server has sent it to the database for validation, and then it will check the first row, and then actually it can able to see that there is an username called admin and the associated password is 123. So what happens here is this particular database will return this row to the server, and depending on how this has to be operated in the web application, the server will send the response to the client. So that is how basic database will work. So when it comes to the type of databases, there are basically two types of databases. First one is relational database, and on the other hand we have non-relational databases. So relational databases are suitable type of databases for banking, healthcare sectors and e-commerce, etc., because this type of databases will organize the data like a table, whereas on the other side we have non-relational databases. These type of databases are very much suitable for social media, IoT systems, gaming, etc. So because these type of applications will require to store information from different data types, and it is very much scalable. So non-relational databases are becoming very suitable types of database for the applications like social media, IoT and gaming. But still, most of the web applications uses relational databases, which actually stores the data in a form of a table like we discussed in the previous slide. So just to give you an visual representation of how actually the relational database will look like, it is actually like a spreadsheet. You can actually see that there is a table called uses. So this is one particular table. So let's call this as table 1. And a particular database may have multiple tables in its entry, and each and every table is identified by its name. So here uses is the table name. So each and every table may have any number of columns to store the information. So here it has 6 columns, which is ID, first name, last name, username, password, and then the last login. So which contains all these informations in a form of a table. So this is a typical example of how a relational database will store information. We can have one more example. like this. Databases may also be used to contain information about the products. So here also we can see this is our second table. So this is our table 2, which is all about products. So here the table name is product. So what happens here is even this particular table will have 6 number of columns, which actually stores the ID, product name, description, cost of that particular product, whether the product is available or not, and who is the shipper if the product is being ordered. So this is an example case, and in real time it may have even more number of columns to represent or to store different informations. I hope now you got a good understanding about what exactly databases are and how relational databases will handle information in the database. Now it's time to understand what exactly SQL query is. SQL is abbreviated as Structured Query Language. Now let us assume that the system is going to interact with the database. And how do we interact? We need a language to communicate with the databases. And this language is what something we call as Structured Query Language. Let us assume that the database is having this users table, which we discussed in the previous slide. Now let us see an example of a small SQL query. This is how the SQL query will look like. Actually, understanding this query is really simple. So we are just asking the database to select, and the star represents all values, followed by from, and here is represented the table name. This is the table name which we are asking the database to look for the data, and this is the condition where id equals to 1. So let's take for an example, when the user inputs id is equals to 1, it actually checks the table if there is an id in the table with the value 1. So it actually checks the table and then it checks the id column. In this particular id column, if there is a value called 1, this condition turns out to be true. And when this particular condition is true, it fetches the specified values. And in this particular query, we have specified to fetch all the values. So what actually happens is all these values related to this particular row will be fetched, and then it will be displayed at the user end. So that's how a basic SQL query will work. Let's have one more example to understand how exactly the SQL queries will work. So let's have a same database and then the system setup, and even also we consider the same users table, but this time let us change a query a little bit. So this time when you look at this particular query, we are asking the database to select only specified number of columns. So we are asking to specify the first name and then the last name from the table called users. So here is the users table. So from this particular table, we are asking the database to fetch only the two columns, first name and then the last name, and only when this particular condition is satisfied. So where user ID is equals to ID, which is represented within a single quote, which means this is an user input. When the user inputs the number 1, 2, 3 or up to 5, then this condition becomes true. Let us assume that the user input is 1. So if we assume that if the user is giving an input as 1, it seems to be, first it checks the users table as it is specified whether the ID is having the value 1. So if the ID is having the value 1, then it selects only the two columns, which means the first name and then the last name as specified in the query. And then this particular information alone will be displayed to the user. Let's assume the user is inputting 3 this time. If the user inputs 3, again the query will check if there is an value called 3 in the ID column. Again, there is an entry called 3 and this condition turns out to be true. When this particular condition turns out to be true, the query will fetch the corresponding first name and then the last name. So here the first name is Carlos and last name is Pat, and this particular information will be displayed to the users. So that's how this particular query will work. Wait, what if when the user inputs number 6? So when the user inputs number 6, then in this particular column there is no number called 6. In this case, this particular where class will become false. And then when the where class becomes false, the database will not return any value. Instead, it throws an error, or it says no entries found, depending on how the web application has been implemented. So the where class can either contain true or it can contain false. It's a Boolean operation. So that's all about how a simple SQL query will look like. I believe this is sufficient for us to understand the hands-on that we are going to see in this particular video. So without any further ado, let's get our hands dirty by practicing. But before that, we have certain things to understand. So let us see an basic query which is submitted for a login form. So in case we have a login form, this is how the query will look like. So select, again we are just typing in *, which means it is going to select all the username from the table called users. This is what the table name, where username is supplied by the user and password is also supplied by the user. Let us assume that the user is inputting this particular string. Now what happens here is this particular string will actually break the command. Yes, so this single quotes is even more dangerous in the SQL query because it actually breaks the syntax. So whatever that you have typed in place of user input, this value will be substituted, and in place of pass input, this thing will be substituted. So what happens here is this particular single quote will actually break the syntax, and then it passes on a different condition like 1 is equals to 1, which means that this condition is always true and it makes the where class always true. So we are setting up the where class to be true always by sending an always true function, and followed by these two hyphens is used for commenting in the databases. So what happens at this particular stage is this particular hyphens will comment out the rest of the syntax so that anything that is after this hyphens will not be considered by the SQL statement. No matter what password that you type, it's not going to check against the value. What actually the database sees is like the SQL see the final query like this. So what happens here is it is going to select all the values from the table users where username is equals to nothing or 1 equals to 1. Maybe this condition is false and this condition is true. So depending upon the OR statement, if either any of this condition becomes true, the final value which is supplied to where class is true. So when this particular where class is true, it is going to fetch all the information from the table users. So as a result, all rows in that particular table will be returned to the server, and the user will be logged in with the very first entry that is present in the table. So that is how the basic exploitation will work. So now we will actually get into the hands-on, and then we will try to understand how exactly this single quotes and all other things would work in a real environment.